For millions of viewers, Johnny Carson was the calm, smiling king of late-night television. Every night, he welcomed Hollywood's biggest stars with charm, wit, and effortless control. But what audiences at home never saw was that not every guest played by the rules. Behind the laughs, the handshakes, and the polite applause, there were moments of tension so uncomfortable they left the studio silent. Over 3 decades on The Tonight Show, Carson hosted thousands of actors. Most were professional, respectful, and grateful to be there. But a select few arrived with oversized egos, sharp attitudes, or behavior that tested Johnny's legendary patience. These were men who talked over the host, ignored cues, mocked the format, or treated the show like it revolved around them. And Johnny noticed everything. What made Carson different was his restraint. He rarely argued on air. He never shouted. Instead, he used timing, silence, and razor-sharp humor to expose awkward moments without ever crossing the line. If a guest made things difficult, Johnny didn't explode. He simply let the audience feel the tension, and that made it far more powerful. Over the years, stories emerged from staff, insiders, and fellow performers about certain male actors who consistently pushed boundaries, clashed with producers, or left Carson visibly unimpressed. Not criminals, not villains, just big stars whose attitudes turned an easy chat into an uncomfortable showdown. Tonight, we're looking back at 11 famous male actors who, according to television history and long-standing Hollywood accounts, were remembered as some of the most difficult guests Johnny Carson ever hosted. This isn't gossip. This isn't character assassination. It's a behind-the-scenes look at ego, fame, and what happens when stardom walks into a room that demands respect. Some of these moments are subtle. Others are impossible to miss. And once you see them, you'll never watch those interviews the same way again. Guest number 1, Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando walked onto The Tonight Show with the reputation of a genius and the attitude of someone who knew it. By the time he sat across from Johnny Carson, Brando wasn't just a movie star. He was a legend who believed rules didn't apply to him. And from the very first exchange, the tension was noticeable. Unlike most guests, Brando didn't come prepared to promote a film or charm the audience. He spoke slowly, dismissed questions, and often redirected the conversation toward himself. When Johnny tried to guide the interview, Brando resisted, sometimes answering with long silences, other times with comments that felt deliberately evasive. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was uncomfortable. What made the moment stand out was how Johnny handled it. Carson stayed calm, kept smiling, and allowed the pauses to hang in the air. He didn't challenge Brando directly. Instead, he let the audience feel the imbalance. A host trying to run a show, and a guest quietly refusing to cooperate. The laughs became nervous. The rhythm of the interview slowed. Something was clearly off. People who worked on the show later described Brando as unpredictable and dismissive of television altogether. He saw late-night interviews as beneath him, and it showed. While other actors treated the couch as an opportunity, Brando treated it like an inconvenience. He wasn't rude in obvious ways, he was worse. He simply didn't care. Johnny Carson valued timing, respect, and flow. Brando disrupted all three. And even though the interview stayed professional on the surface, viewers could sense that this was not a conversation between equals. It was a quiet power struggle, and one of the earliest examples of a major star testing Johnny Carson's legendary patience. Guest number 2, Orson Welles. Orson Welles arrived on The Tonight Show carrying the weight of his own legend. By that point, he wasn't just an actor or director. He was a symbol of old-school genius who expected to be treated as such. And from the moment the interview began, it was clear he wasn't interested in playing along. Welles spoke with authority, often turning simple questions into long monologues. When Johnny Carson tried to steer the conversation, Welles frequently overpowered it, interrupting or redirecting the topic back to himself. The interview stopped feeling like a dialogue and started sounding like a lecture. The audience laughed, but not always comfortably. What made the situation tense wasn't anger or insults. It was dominance. Welles treated the couch like a stage and Johnny like a supporting character. He corrected details, dismissed lighthearted questions, and showed little patience for the show's usual rhythm. For late-night television, where timing is everything, that created friction. Johnny, as always, stayed composed. He let Welles talk. He smiled, nodded, and waited. But every so often, Carson slipped in a subtle remark or perfectly timed pause that reminded viewers who actually controlled the room. It was calm. It was clever. And it exposed the imbalance without turning the moment ugly. People close to the show later described Wells as brilliant but difficult, someone who respected talent, but not formats. He didn't see himself as a guest. He saw himself as the main event. And while that confidence impressed some viewers, others sensed the strain it placed on the host. This wasn't a disaster interview. It was something quieter and more revealing, a clash between a disciplined broadcaster and a towering ego. And in that clash, Johnny Carson once again proved that sometimes the strongest response is simply letting the audience see the truth for themselves. Guest number 3, Chevy Chase. Chevy Chase came onto The Tonight Show with the confidence of a comedian who believed he already owned the room. At the height of his fame, Chase was known for fast jokes, sharp timing, and a habit of pushing boundaries. But on Johnny Carson's couch, that energy didn't always land the way he expected. From the start, Chase leaned heavily into sarcasm. He interrupted, talked over punchlines, and sometimes treated the interview like a competition instead of a conversation. Rather than letting Johnny set the pace, Chase tried to steer the show himself, firing off jokes that undercut the host or shifted attention back to him. The tension wasn't obvious at first. The audience laughed, but there was an edge to it, the kind that feels less playful and more self-serving. Carson, a master of comic timing, didn't rise to it. He let the jokes hang. He allowed the moments to breathe. And in doing so, he made it clear who understood late-night television and who was simply trying to dominate it. Behind the scenes, Chase had already developed a reputation for being difficult with colleagues and dismissive toward those he didn't consider equals. On The Tonight Show, that attitude came through subtly. He wasn't hostile. He was careless with respect. Johnny valued collaboration. Chevy Chase valued control. And that difference turned what should have been an easy, fun interview into something slightly awkward and quietly competitive. It wasn't a blow-up. It was a reminder that even comedians can misjudge the room. And in that misjudgment, the audience could feel the shift, the moment when humor turns tense and charm starts to wear thin. Guest number 4, Bill Murray. Bill Murray's appearances on The Tonight Show were never predictable, and that unpredictability was both his strength and his problem. Known for his dry delivery and unconventional humor, Murray often treated interviews as performances rather than conversations. And for Johnny Carson, that made things complicated. Instead of answering questions directly, Murray frequently deflected with irony or silence. He leaned into awkwardness, sometimes stretching pauses so long they felt deliberate. The audience laughed, but not always because they understood the joke. At times, it felt like Murray was testing how far he could push the format without fully breaking it. Johnny tried to keep the interview moving, gently guiding questions back on track. Murray resisted. He spoke in half answers, changed subjects without warning, and occasionally seemed more interested in confusing the room than connecting with it. It wasn't rude in the traditional sense, it was detached. People who worked in television often described Murray as brilliant but challenging. He played by his own rules, and if a setting felt too controlled, he pushed against it. On Carson's couch, that resistance slowed the pace and created moments of visible discomfort. What made the exchange memorable was restraint. Johnny didn't confront Murray or force clarity. He let the confusion sit. And in that space, viewers could sense the imbalance. A host trying to run a live broadcast and a guest deliberately avoiding structure. It wasn't hostility. It was friction, a clash between discipline and unpredictability. And while some viewers loved the strangeness, others could tell that this was not the smooth, respectful exchange Johnny Carson valued most. Guest number 5, Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds came onto The Tonight Show with movie star charm and undeniable confidence. He was funny, relaxed, and knew exactly how much the audience loved him. But that same confidence sometimes crossed into something less comfortable, a sense that the rules didn't quite apply. During his appearances, Reynolds often leaned into teasing, pushing jokes just a little too far. He interrupted, took over punchlines, and occasionally brushed past Johnny's questions to steer the spotlight back onto himself. The audience laughed, but there were moments when the laughter felt forced, like everyone was waiting to see how far he'd go. What made it tense was tone. Reynolds wasn't openly disrespectful, but he treated the interview like friendly combat. He challenged the host, mocked the structure, and acted as though the show was a shared stage rather than Johnny's domain. For a host who valued rhythm and control, that created friction. Johnny handled it with calm precision. He smiled, paused, and waited. And when Reynolds pushed too hard, Carson responded with perfectly timed silence or a subtle remark that gently reasserted authority without embarrassment. It was professional, but the tension was real. Behind the scenes, Reynolds had a reputation for being competitive and self-assured to the point of arrogance. On The Tonight Show, that edge occasionally surfaced. He wasn't there to misbehave. He was there to win the room. And in trying to do that, Reynolds sometimes forgot the balance that made Carson's show work. The result wasn't chaos, but a quiet reminder that charm alone doesn't always equal respect. Guest number 6, Charlie Sheen. When Charlie Sheen appeared on The Tonight Show, he carried the confidence of a rising star who knew the spotlight was firmly on him. At the time, Sheen was riding success and attention, and that energy followed him onto Johnny Carson's couch, sometimes in ways that felt unsettled rather than entertaining. Sheen often spoke quickly, jumped between thoughts, and seemed more focused on projecting an image than engaging in a steady conversation. Questions were brushed past, jokes were redirected, and the interview rhythm felt rushed. It wasn't outright disrespect, but it lacked grounding. Johnny attempted to slow things down, guiding the discussion with calm prompts and light humor. Sheen resisted the pace. He interrupted, leaned into bravado, and treated the moment like a performance instead of an exchange. The audience responded with uncertain laughter, the kind that signals curiosity mixed with discomfort. People in the industry later described Sheen's early fame as overwhelming, and on The Tonight Show, that pressure showed. He appeared restless, eager to control the narrative, and unwilling to fully settle into the format. For a live broadcast, that unpredictability created tension. Johnny didn't challenge him. He let the behavior speak for itself. The pauses, the side glances, the slowed timing. All of it made the imbalance visible without ever turning confrontational. It wasn't chaos. It was a glimpse of a young star struggling with control and attention on one of television's most disciplined stages. And that contrast made the appearance memorable for reasons beyond promotion. Guest number 7, Sean Penn. Sean Penn's appearances on The Tonight Show carried an intensity that immediately set him apart. Even early in his career, Penn had a reputation for seriousness, and that seriousness didn't always translate well to late-night television. From the moment he sat down, the mood shifted. Penn answered questions carefully, sometimes defensively. Light jokes were met with short replies. Attempts at humor often fell flat, not because Johnny missed the mark, but because Penn seemed unwilling to play along. The interview felt tight, controlled, and noticeably tense. Johnny tried to soften the atmosphere, easing into topics and offering space for relaxed conversation. Penn resisted that looseness. He corrected phrasing, questioned assumptions, and treated the exchange more like a debate than a chat. The audience sensed it. The laughter became quieter, more hesitant. What stood out wasn't hostility, but rigidity. Penn appeared uncomfortable with the casual nature of the format, as if he didn't trust it. For a show built on flow and warmth, that created friction. Johnny, ever composed, didn't push back. He let the stiffness remain visible. People familiar with Penn's public persona often described him as principled and intense, but difficult in informal settings. On Carson's couch, that intensity worked against him. Instead of connection, it created distance. The interview wasn't dramatic. There was no outburst. But it lingered in memory because it showed how quickly a late-night conversation can turn awkward when a guest refuses to relax. And once again, Johnny Carson proved that sometimes the tension says more than words ever could. Guest number 8, Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney came onto The Tonight Show with decades of fame behind him and a deep belief in his own legacy. As one of Hollywood's earliest child stars turned adult performer, Rooney expected respect, and he wasn't shy about demanding it, even in subtle ways. During his appearances, Rooney often dominated the conversation. He interrupted, corrected Johnny, and frequently steered discussions back to his past achievements. What could have been nostalgic storytelling sometimes felt like self-promotion that ignored the rhythm of the show. Johnny attempted to keep things light, offering humor and gentle transitions. Rooney resisted being guided. He spoke over cues, dismissed jokes, and treated the interview less like a shared moment and more like a personal showcase. The audience responded politely, but the energy felt uneven. What made the situation tense wasn't anger, but entitlement. Rooney carried himself as someone who believed his history gave him control of the room. For a host known for structure and timing, that attitude created quiet friction. People who worked with Rooney often described him as passionate but demanding. On The Tonight Show, that side emerged clearly. He wasn't trying to offend. He simply refused to step back. Johnny never challenged him directly. He allowed the imbalance to show, using pauses and subtle humor to gently regain control. It was respectful, but revealing. The interview became memorable not for conflict, but for contrast, a veteran star clinging to authority and a host who never needed to raise his voice to keep it. Guest number 9, Robert Blake. Robert Blake appeared on The Tonight Show with a reputation for being unpredictable and intense. Unlike many guests who embraced the warmth and rhythm of Johnny Carson's hosting style, Blake often seemed detached, keeping the audience and host on edge without overt hostility. From the moment the interview began, Blake leaned into sarcasm and dry humor that sometimes missed the mark. He challenged questions, answered indirectly, and occasionally ignored the cues that kept the show moving smoothly. The audience laughed, but there was a subtle unease, the kind that signals tension under the surface. Johnny handled Blake with his trademark calm. He allowed pauses to hang, used timing to highlight awkward moments, and never confronted the actor directly. This made the discomfort visible to viewers while keeping the conversation professional. Blake's behavior wasn't aggressive. It was distant, unpredictable, and often self-focused. People who worked in television described him as someone who didn't always play by the rules of live interaction, and it showed clearly on Carson's couch. What made the interview memorable was the contrast between Carson's measured control and Blake's defiance of expectation. The exchange was quiet but potent, a lesson in how personality clashes can be felt without shouting. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't a meltdown. It was tension wrapped in subtlety, the kind of moment that reminds audiences that even a calm, legendary host can face a guest who refuses to follow the usual script. Guest number 10, Klaus Kinski. Klaus Kinski walked onto The Tonight Show carrying a reputation that preceded him. Known for his intensity on set, Kinski's energy was electric, but it often veered into unpredictable territory. On Carson's couch, that intensity created moments that were both fascinating and slightly uncomfortable. From the start, Kinski spoke with a sharp focus, sometimes leaning into dramatic pauses or veering off topic. Johnny tried to guide the interview lightly, but Kinski occasionally redirected the conversation to his own stories or personal reflections, ignoring cues that would normally keep the exchange smooth. The tension wasn't loud. There were no arguments or raised voices. Instead, it was a quiet pressure, the kind that makes viewers feel the weight of a guest who refuses to follow the usual rhythm. Audience reactions shifted between laughs and nervous anticipation, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Johnny, as always, remained calm and measured. He let pauses speak, used timing subtly, and highlighted awkwardness with gentle humor. Kinski's unpredictability became part of the performance, showing how a strong personality could dominate a room without overt hostility. Behind the scenes, staff described Kinski as brilliant but volatile, someone whose presence demanded attention. On The Tonight Show, it was clear why he was remembered as a challenging guest. It wasn't rudeness, it was energy that didn't conform to convention. The result was memorable, a display of talent, unpredictability, and charisma, all held in check by Carson's legendary poise. Guest number 11, James Cagney. James Cagney was a Hollywood legend long before he sat on Johnny Carson's couch, and his presence carried the authority of decades in film. He wasn't a difficult man in the traditional sense, but his confidence and wit sometimes made interviews more challenging than expected. During his appearance, Cagney shared stories with pride, occasionally taking control of the narrative and speaking in his own rhythm. Johnny attempted to guide the discussion naturally, but Cagney's strong personality subtly overrode the usual pacing of the show. It wasn't overtly disruptive, but viewers could sense the push and pull of control. Cagney's humor was sharp and his anecdotes precise, sometimes leaving little room for follow-up questions. The audience laughed, but the exchange carried an air of formality that made the interview feel more like a masterclass than a casual chat. Johnny handled it expertly. He listened, smiled, and allowed the stories to unfold, subtly using timing and pauses to maintain balance. The energy wasn't tense or negative, but it highlighted the dynamic between a host who values flow and a guest who naturally commands attention. Behind the scenes, people remembered Cagney as professional but strong-willed, someone whose experience gave him authority and whose personality demanded respect. On Carson's show, that translated into an unforgettable appearance, smooth on the surface, but quietly marked by the presence of a true legend. The interview was calm, respectful, and entirely safe for broadcast, yet it remains memorable precisely because of the contrast between two powerful personalities in the same room.